Welcome to episode 286 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Cory McGookin, who served in the FBI for 20 years. Cory was first assigned to the Chicago division in the West RA, our resident agency, where he was on a gang squad that focused on the western suburbs of Illinois. In this episode, he reviews the investigation he led targeting the Latin Kings operating in the city of Aurora and Operation First Degree Burn, a cold case multi-agency task force which resulted in the nation's largest ever cold case murder takedown. 31 Latin King members were charged with 22 murders going back 2 decades. For his work on this case, Cory was the recipient of several recognition and achievement awards, including the Star of Distinction from the Chicago Crime Commission. According to Wikipedia, the almighty Latin King and Queen Nation, known simply as Latin Kings, is the largest Hispanic and Latino street and prison gang worldwide. Later in his career, he became an instructor at the FBI Academy, where he was the confidential human source program manager for new agent trainees. He then transferred to the Office of Congressional Affairs, where he served as a congressional liaison. But missing the casework, he eventually stepped down and returned to the case agent position at the Washington Field Office, WFO. He was on squads that worked intellectual property, computer crime, and intelligence matters. During the last part of Cory's career, he was selected for his dream job as a leadership instructor for the National Academy. After several years of teaching graduate and undergraduate classes to law enforcement executives, he was hand-selected to serve as the chief of the National Academy, running the program until his retirement. Currently, Cory is working as the Senior Vice President of Law Enforcement Relations for the nonprofit Dedication to Community, D2C, bringing the police and the community together. He is also the coach training director for Performance Protocol, building strong and capable leaders within law enforcement agencies by providing personal and professional development. Both positions allow Cory to continue spreading the best practice lessons from the National Academy. After the case review, Cory and I chat about the National Academy and law enforcement coaching. Good stuff. Now, before we get to the interview, I want to give a shout out to my friend, Patrick O'Donnell, who's running the Cops and Writers Interactive Conference 2023, also known as Cop Camp. In Cop Camp, you'll learn how to improve your crime stories at a real working police and fire academy complex. The instructors will cover topics from firearms to fingerprints. Cop Camp is June 1st through June 4th in lovely Appleton, Wisconsin. Unfortunately, I won't be there because I'll be at Thriller Fest in New York, but you don't have to miss Cop Camp. To learn more about the Cops and Writers Interactive Conference, go to premeditatedfiction.com. If you want to know more about Thriller Fest, visit my website, jerrywilliams.com. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com. You'll also find links to where you can buy me a coffee, join my reader team, and learn more about me and my books. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Cory McGookin. Hey, Cory, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm really excited about this because news reports tell us that the murder rate in our cities today is sky high. To be able to look at this case that you're going to talk about today that occurred many, many years ago, I think it will give us maybe hope that we're going to be able to get a handle on what's going on today.
Yeah, I hope so, because this is a story of cooperation, and I think that's part of the answer.
I've read the different articles and links that you sent me, so I have a fair understanding of this case, but I guess we could say it involved the Latin kings and just the total takeover that they had of a city near Chicago. Well, where do you want to start?
When I came out of academy and I landed in the West RA of Chicago, the West Resident Agency, we were focusing on Aurora, Illinois. And I think it would be helpful, Jerry, to paint the picture, take you back to 2002 and what that city looks like and what was going on there.
Aurora sounds like a lovely place, but I guess at the time it wasn't.
Yeah, it had fallen on hard times when I got there. It's along the Fox River. There's a lot of communities that take advantage of the waterfront. They have like nice, historic, beautiful homes, but Aurora just kind of fallen into a bad place. It's actually the second largest city in Illinois, and almost nobody knows that outside of Aurora. It's a typical Midwestern city, but back then it was about 160, 170,000. It eventually got to about 200,000 people when you get a few years later into the timeline. It's one of those Midwest cities, mid-size. It was very diverse, pretty large Hispanic population, a decent African-American population, and a mixed white population, and a little bit of others, really, really diverse. But the gangs have slowly, since the 1980s, taken over. And the Latin Kings were kind of the big dog. And that's a gang that's very popular in Chicago and had a lot of numbers. So it makes sense that over the years, they kind of set up a franchise in Aurora, which is 40 miles to the west of Chicago. There's also a big rival with the Latin Kings called the Insane Deuces, which was another Hispanic gang predominantly. But it had some of the black gangs coming out of Chicago. It had the Gangster Disciples. It had the Vice Lords. There was the Maniac Latin Disciples, the MLDs. Quite a few gangs, but the big dogs were the Latin Kings who really tried to run the city and were very proud about that. So they were predominantly the ones who were creating the most violence and instigating things. So it was a lot of crime, a lot of drug trafficking, and just in general, the city was very much suffering when I arrived in 2002.
As far as numbers, can you tell us how many members they had?
On the registry, the police would obviously work very close with us, and they'd have several hundred registered Latin Kings. Now, some of those had been, when they were younger, part of it and kind of faded away or moved. Some were incarcerated, some were deceased, but there was always new, younger people coming in. That was really the difficult part, is there were so many 13, 14, 15-year-olds who were hanging around the gang like they were just going to get into it. There was no way around it. They were going to choose to be, particularly if you're Hispanic, you're going to be an Insane Deuce or a Latin King when you're from certain parts of the city. And there really didn't seem to be a very good third option of not joining either. They were kind of caught up in that.
Well, that's really sad to hear that there were no options.
There was a few cops who came from the neighborhoods who really were valuable because they understood that community so well. But like they mentioned, most of the people who they grew up with didn't take that path. There's very few success stories. And so I think we really saw it as, we want to give the people a chance. We want to give these young people a chance. Try to reduce the gang influence to a point where people can make other decisions and we can have kind of a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious cycle going on in that town. One thing I want to highlight, Jerry, is I'm going to talk a lot about my experience, the FBI, what we did, but this was absolutely a concerted effort by all folks. We took the lead as the FBI for the Latin Kings. We had the most agents. We're just one of the largest federal agencies out there. But the ATF, who was also working in the area and doing the gang work, focused on the Insane Deuces. We had the DEA and Customs and IRS all participating in their own way. Obviously, the Aurora Police Department, the King County Sheriff's Office, everyone was putting their focus together on this city, trying to do what we could to clean it up. I'd have to say that really reminds me of that J. Edgar Hoover quote, and I know we have it at the memorial at Quantico, where he talked about the most effective weapon against crime is cooperation. The efforts of all law enforcement agencies with the support and understanding of the American people. That's exactly what we lived. I think that's how we got done what we did get done.
Was this a task force?
It was a Safe Streets task force. We did have several officers from the Aurora Police Department who are working with us. And sometimes Kane County would be participating, but not officially on the task force. But what that allowed us to do was, as some of you may know, when you're on a task force, it allows those federal dollars to be freed up to get more resources to the cops, who then in turn work with the FBI specifically on those tasks. We were able to get cars and radios and phones and everything to allow them to also be able to do some of the federal paperwork that we're going to need to take these cases to federal court and get real heavy sentences on the gang members. I landed there out of Quantico, and it just could not have been better for a young age. I was 30 at the time. I'd been a cryptologic airborne Spanish linguist in the Air Force before, so I had no law enforcement background. Go to the academy, you learn what you got to learn. And I arrived there, and they're just rocking and rolling with what's going on. There was a senior agent named Paul Bach, who is just a wonderful man. He'd been working out there for many, many years, had all the relationships in place, and just the right attitude towards working hard for the people in those communities and doing what we could. So great mentor to fall right into the situation. They're already up on a wiretap. And so immediately you're put into the Title III room, listening to calls and doing surveillances and using a lot of the investigative techniques, the sophisticated ones particularly, that you need to take down these violent groups.
And you were selected for that, I take it, because you spoke fluent Spanish?
I'd like to give the FBI credit of being able to see that, but when I was coming out of the academy, they just created this squad. They'd always had Paul and a few others working gangs in the western suburbs, and they realized the problem was significant enough that they created a West RA gang squad, and they shifted some people there, and I think I might have been the next guy coming out of the academy, and they needed more bodies. So I landed in a great place where everyone wanted to be, because everyone lives in a city called Naperville, which is out that way. A shorter commute. People were very envious of me that I got straight out there. And I have to say, just incredible work happening, hit the ground running. I had a lot of fun doing that too, really putting those skills to use that weren't just part of training, but were necessary. And good mentors, 5,000 calls recorded. What was really unique of our first case, there was a target that went by the name Orko, who was a big-time drug trafficker. He was a Latin king, but he really focused on the business side of the drug trafficking, and he was very good at it. He did his business right. He showed up when he said he would. He was very efficient, and he was very careful. So it kind of made him a hard person sometimes for us to be surveilling and trying to gain our evidence on. And perfect timing. When we were done with the wiretap, we were on like our 59th of 60 days, and the wiretap's about to go down. We're still not sure where the supply is coming from. And he gets the call, and another load is ready. He's going to go meet his supplier and get more cocaine. They were trafficking in kilos of cocaine. So we set up the whole surveillance team. We got plane overhead, and we were going to find out where the source of supply was coming from. What's funny, we later arrested him, and we got some background on what was going on. It was just his practice. He was doing odd things. He was on a highway, and he would take like a U-turn. He would go under a bridge and just pull over the side of the road and stop for like 10 minutes. Very careful person. Well, it worked. As he was going through the city of Chicago, we actually lost him, our surveillance. We were very disappointed, but we waited for him to come back west. Eventually, we saw his car. He was coming back, heading back home to Aurora. And when he got in town, we had a marked unit pull him over. That led a little chase. He realized he had cocaine and he was going to get in trouble. So he tried to make it away. He didn't. Foot chase. He was caught, and there's 50 kilos in his trunk. So that was a nice prize at the end of the wiretap.
I'm surprised that somebody at his level didn't send somebody else out. Actually, maybe he met with the people, but I guess I'm watching too much TV, but would have an underling actually transport the cocaine back into the city.
I tell you what, he had a handful of people who were close to him that he trusted that did things, but he was a serious businessman who did it right. And I got to tell you, Jerry, it's pretty rare. Typically, the frustration of an agent is there's an arranged drug deal that's going to happen at 7 p.m. So you start getting set up about 6 o'clock, and they're such bad businessmen. They put it off. It doesn't happen till like 11:30 at night. So you're just wasting a lot of time because they're just not serious about what they do. He was, and I don't think he trusted other people. He really took it on himself. It was bizarre. He was married, which was odd for the gang members in their young 20s out there. He had 2 kids, and it was like every day he was like, I'm going to work. And he left the house and he did his thing and to make money and came back home. So he was very unique.
Sounds like one of those kids that would have opted for another life if there were more options.
I'm telling you, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I spent a lot of time with him after he's arrested and he's cooperating, and we're just spending a lot of time transporting them, interviews. I said, man, if you were born in a different situation, you would have been the CEO of a company or something. He really was smart, hardworking, good intuition on things. He had all the right stuff. It's just he put it towards drug trafficking. And he was very successful because 50 kilos is a lot of cocaine. You figure even back then, we're going $20,000 per kilo if you're getting it pretty cheap, maybe more like $25,000 per kilo. So that's serious weight and that's serious money he's dealing with. He really rose up. What's funny is the next day, the Latin Kings didn't really trust him because, like I said, he focused on the business and he wasn't really as heavily into the gang, that they didn't want him hurting witness. So they wanted to bail him out. So they got money together. They show up at the county office the next day with $500,000 in cash. Fortunately, like I said, Paul Bach was the old agent out there who'd been around and he had the connection. So someone called him and let him know. And he was like, count that money really, really slow. So we were able to get to a prosecutor and get some paperwork and basically seize that $500,000 as suspected drug proceeds, which we then eventually kept. He was not released. So to him, at this point, it's still the state got me. They got whatever I need to fight this. He's got a lawyer. But we were near the end. So it was only about a month later, we did our first federal sweep where we took 19 people from that case, from those wiretaps, and arrested them. We were able a couple months later to add 12 more. And then it was when we got into 2003, we even did a third. We were able to get 58 different people arrested, 35 being Latin Kings, all based on that drug trafficking conspiracy, all based on Oracle, the main target. Most of them cooperated. One thing I have to say is that all of these guys grew up playing the system in Aurora. They would do what they do. They would get caught. They would fight the case. They would be looking at 10, 15 years. An overwhelmed state's attorney would let it plead down. Then they would get good time served. And 4 years later, they'd be out. And then they get caught again. And that was basically a revolving door of their life. It's just the game they played and the game they understood. So I got to understand, we come in federally and it's all based on your criminal history points for your sentencing. And then on the other side is how much proof we have of the amount of drugs that you were involved with. And when we start saying you're involved with multiple kilos and your criminal history is really bad, you're starting at 30 years federally and you're going to serve 85% of that if everything goes perfect. That got their attention real quick. And all of the loyalty and the gang comes first and not snitching, all that stuff. Well, when you're looking at 30 years plus 85%, almost all of them had the same reaction. They all basically said, what do I got to tell you to make this better? And so they all started cooperating, which led making it easier for the others who maybe didn't want to cooperate because everyone was going to testify against them. They realized they had no case. So they realized they might as well just cooperate as well and reduce the sentence. So that's just how we did our work out there.
So it was like dominoes, one falling after another.
They were. And as soon as you said, hey, we already got enough cooperators, we're not even sure we care if you cooperate at this point, right? They were almost like begging. Well, my lawyer says I'm looking at 28 years, but I might be able to get this down to like 16 or 17 if I cooperate. I want to cooperate. What do I got to do? So that really opened up what was going on in that city from that maybe original suite of those 58 and the information they gave us, which allowed us to do more and more and more.
Can we go back a little bit and talk about The Wire and what it was producing? What were you hearing on The Wire that allowed you to make these arrests?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, I got really fluent in how they talk, which kind of shocked me. I always joked about the street Cory version of myself because it was all coded language. It's not the way you talk in public in general. You'd call Oracle, you're like, hey, Oracle, you good? Which meant, do you have a supply? You're like, yeah, I'm good. He's like, okay, I want to come through, which just means meet up or come to your house or whatever. And he's like, okay, why don't you meet me behind the spot we always go? What do you need? They wouldn't say ounces, and they were typically buying ounces cocaine from him. They would say onions or tires or something, which we would laugh when they say, I want 3.5 onions or 3.5 tires. Who's ordering a half a tire? How are you going to explain this way? So we knew from having a lot of intelligence exactly where they were going to meet. Typically, we're there first and we're getting the photographs. We are listening to everything. We are getting the license plates and pictures. In a lot of aspects, once we got you, we got you. I don't know how you'd have any chance of not being found guilty with all the evidence we collected and we required before we would even come arrest you. Occasionally, they would talk violence on the wire. But again, this is Orko, businessman. There's a lot of just straight up business. He didn't talk a lot of the gang stuff and some of those inner workings. We had people later that would do that. But he was, how do I sell as much drugs as I can, as fast as possible, get reloaded and make more money. Right from the beginning, I think we were looking strategically at getting the right people. Because with some of these drug conspiracy cases, you need to do some controlled buys, we call them, where you have to get a source or get somebody, an undercover, someone to go buy drugs from somebody a couple times using the same telephone. And then you're able to tell a court, I have proof this person is using this telephone for these drug transactions because 3 times we've had a source or an undercover or something call this number, say these things, and buy drugs, and then be able to get up on a wiretap. A lot of this led to cooperators wanting to have others come help them cooperate by coming in and saying, we can be that for you to help you get more people. We know the other drug dealers, who's moving serious weight and who you can get. So like you said, it was dominoes for them cooperating and whatever, but it also became almost like a domino effect of all the other people we got access to in the city. We had limited resources. Our squad was 12 agents, but only a couple of us, me and my partner Larissa, mainly focused on Aurora, and some pairs of the other agents were focused on the other cities and the western suburbs. So we didn't have unlimited resources, so we had to be strategic. So we were looking at going at those that we thought would make the most impact, were the most violent, controlling the most drugs, or had rape within the gangs. For instance, one thing I found interesting is we were able to, with a very good United States attorney who really was willing to let us try to make a difference, we went after one of the leaders of the gang, and he'd been a thorn in the side in that city for many, many years. The rumor was that he had land in Mexico and some like farms and some businesses. He was very connected to some Mexican cartels and he had a lot of resources, a lot of money. So we were worried about him fleeing if we ever went after him because he had a place to go and apparently money stashed away. Well, we did go after him and we got enough cooperators and evidence to go do a search warrant on a place he had. And the search warrant, we came up empty for drugs, but we found multiple scales. We were able to send those to the lab and they're able to find trace detection amounts of cocaine on those scales, which allowed us to charge them dry conspiracy, we called it. We charged them because of all the witnesses we had of dealing with him, of seeing him have multiple kilos of cocaine, and then finding the scale on his property and having witnesses be able to identify those scales as the ones he weighed them on when they made purchases, all that. We were able to arrest him and get a major person off the streets. The one thing Paul Bach and I were really fascinated by is, again, we were afraid this guy could run, and he went to trial. And at one point we're waiting, and he is not locked up at this point, but he comes in the federal courtroom in Chicago and we're waiting for the jury to come back. And we get a note from the judge's secretary that the jury is finished with the first part, but they still have to move on the second part. So they're going to be a while. Well, there's only a second part if they find guilty on the first part. Basically, it's like they found him guilty of the drug trafficking. And now they have to figure out how much drugs they can put within the conspiracy for his sentencing. So he knows he's guilty. And as soon as that's said, he drops his head and he goes to the bathroom and we walk away. The bitch hits us. Oh my God, this guy, he knows he's guilty. He's going to run. So we were able to get the marshals and kind of block the doors and keep an eye on him. And he never did make a run for it. He showed up a couple hours later, took a sentence, was given 30 years and just one more box check for us, kind of getting the people who are harming that community off the streets.
And why do you think he didn't run? Because he knew that you were watching him and there was security in the courthouse?
It's really fascinating. And Paul Bach and I talked about this. The fact that we're not sure why, because we were quiet about letting the marshals know and all of that. The answer is, Jerry, I don't know, because I'm thinking, why not make a run for it? You're about to go down for a long time. So I'm just glad he did. He was an important person. That's just one more detour off of that main case. Like, everyone starts cooperating and you start getting lots of information. You say, okay, what can we do with this new information we got? How can we be judicious and go after the people where we get the most bang for our buck? And another interesting thing off that initial case is another leader. I think at this point, he is the leader of the gang. And we're able to get him arrested, but this is within the state, not federally. He goes by Oso. Oso's locked up, and he's calling in some odd people to come visit him while he's locked up. And we know he's the leader of the gang, and he's probably trying to hand off the power of the control of the Latin Kings to others, or maybe still call the shots from the inside.
What do you mean by odd?
He's got people who wouldn't typically come anywhere near anything law enforcement because they themselves maybe wanted. They're some of the worst of the worst. A lot of times you'd see the visitors being girlfriends or relatives of others within the gang, but the gang members themselves showing up seemed pretty gutsy because they knew that would draw attention. But he specifically had asked for a gang member who was maybe the most violent out of them all shows up, and you have no right to privacy when you're incarcerated. It's well known. So we're listening to everything. It's being recorded and we're listening. And there's just some odd blanks. He's saying, hey, we need to do this. And then that's it. He's like, you know what I'm saying? And we're not following, quite honestly. When he's done, the visitor goes away. He's cupped back up. And on his way out, we see he throws a piece of paper in the trash can in the corner. So we go get it, and we can tell it was a scrap piece of paper that he'd written something on it, but he'd erased everything. We didn't know what was there. We sent that to the lab, to the question documents section, and just amazing the work they did. They were able to pull out everything that was written, and he was giving the address for the witness against him. And it wrote quotes about, this is the only way I go down if this guy's living. You need to go handle this business. And we were able to take the recording and the gaps and obviously show something written that filled in the gap perfectly that told the story. So it's one of my first examples of working with the lab and some of the incredible technology and resources we have.
All right. So my question is, how long did that take? And in the meantime, what happened with that witness?
I don't know if this is normal, but the lab got back to us within like 2 or 3 days. Fortunately, nothing happened to the witness. As soon as we got the results and we saw the address on the note and we knew who lived there and we put into context exactly what they were talking about, we were able to get people over there to get that person moved and protect them. He ended up getting 30 years. So again, we took another gang member leader down, another Latin King down. But I tell you what's funny, Jerry, is it left a vacuum. We're doing good work. Oracle's kind of the big deal with the drug trafficking. He's helping his gang members get supplies so they can sell it, so they can make money. And they're relying on him. So we take that away and we're taking some of the leaders of the gang away. Well, it left a power vacuum and you got some of the younger, not as mature people who filled the void. And in some ways, it made it almost worse. Then we had to turn our attention, okay, what's the next thing? And it's a group called the Latin Homeboys, who are kind of an offshoot of the Latin Kings, but were friendly. And eventually they just all merged and there were no homeboys. It's a term we used because they used to be a thing, but they weren't anymore. They were just Latin Kings now. But they grew up in a certain neighborhood. They were all tight, very friendly with each other. So they kind of filled that void. A new target that went by Eskimo started being able to get a big supply of drugs. Some of the people he was tight with started rising through the ranks and taking the leadership position within the gang. I don't want to say we were right back where we started, but that didn't put an end to the gang. The Latin Kings were still out there. It just didn't stop the gang from doing the shootings and everything they were doing because we made that initial arrest. They just reloaded and they were going at it again.
When you say it made it worse, what do you mean?
It made it worse in that now we were left trying to figure out who's calling the shots, who's doing what. There used to be typical paths with the old leadership of who they went to, who did what, who was the enforcer, which was in charge of certain things within the gang, who was number one, the Inca, the Cacique, the number one, the number two, and all the different roles. Well, when you have a shakeup in leadership and a shakeup in personnel, now there's new people out there doing those same roles, but we don't know who they are. They're kind of undisciplined. They're younger. Now they need to prove themselves. So maybe they're not feeling they've really done enough violence or shootings of the insane deuces or other rivals to merit the spot. So they're out to prove that they deserve what they got and that they're there for the gang. So almost a little uptick in some of the violence and the shootings. What we noticed over time is once the Latin Kings started causing more problems, there would be retaliation. Obviously, the insane deuces aren't just going to take it. They would look to find the Latin Kings somewhere not paying attention that they could shoot and kill. And the gangster disciples, the same thing, or the vice lords. So the kings were always instigating the problems. As they went, the city and the violence seemed to go. So even more, we knew this is where we needed to put our focus. Not that it was important what the ATF was doing with the insane deuces and their arrests and everything else, but we knew if we were going to make a real difference in the city, it had to be at the expense of the Latin Kings. We were able to move on to a next case with Eskimo. Same thing. We were able to get up on a wire, listen to the calls, hearing the same thing.
This predication for the wire, was it concentrating on drug activity, or had you moved now to the violence, the violent crime and the murder aspect of the case?
It was still the drug conspiracies. That was our bread and butter with our arrests and with the authority that we had federally as the FBI. The drug conspiracies came with a big punch in sentencing and normally would get a large swath of them out of the way. Typically, we're chasing the drugs and hoping to get more knowledge on the violence and the shootings. And something unique happened with the case with Eskimo is, I think in hindsight, the prosecutor working the case, Assistant United States Attorney, was just busy. The little bit of a put off is, hey, we need more. You're not really ready for the arrest yet. Go get some more evidence. And it was, we really need someone on the inside to tell the story in case nobody cooperates. It left me in kind of a weird position of, okay, I got to find someone on the inside who's going to go against the entire gang and their friends and cooperate with me. It was serendipitous that was put on me because going through the wire, and I always, as a case agent, I listen to every call, all the thousands of them. So you really got to know people, their intonations, things they talked about. And there's one guy, Andy, who just seemed not like the rest. I just felt like maybe he's the one. So I did something that I was judged for not being as tactically smart, but I talked my squad into doing. We used the evidence we had to get a search warrant just to have a conversation with them. We did the search warrant early in the morning, quietly, no more units out front. We almost snuck up to the back door of where he lived. And instead of knocking down the door, I called him on the cell phone and said, hey, this is the FBI. You need to come open your door. We need to talk. Now, it's a little bit of criticism that he could have gotten a gun and been ready for us to enter. We lost our element of surprise. He could have been flushing whatever evidence. But I felt the case was already strong with the wiretap. It's not like we needed more evidence. What we needed was a cooperator. I was able to go in. He opened the door. He let us in. We searched. I was able to sit down at a kitchen table with them for a few hours and just kind of explain the situation. Here's where you are. Here's the evidence we already got on you. You can tell us to pounce in and wait a couple months. And when we come back, your life will never be the same. Or you can say, I'm willing to help you guys now to make it better on myself. And Jerry, probably the biggest surprise in my career was when Andy says, I've been waiting for this opportunity my entire life. He said, I'm tired of this crap. My brother got killed in this. I'm tired of faking I'm this hard guy. What do I got to do? So he came on board as a source to do recordings and do everything he could. That's when things get real easy, right? When you got someone on the inside, getting them on tape, admitting everything. And then when you go to trial, it's very easy.
Before you move on, you saw that. What was it about him? I mean, you picked him as the person to become the cooperator. And you were right. What was it that you saw in him? I mean, obviously, he's another one of those kids who would have chosen a different option if there was one available. How did you know that?
I think it was less than what he said on the wiretaps. It's what he didn't do. He was never out there really trying to put the bravado out. Occasionally, he would be de-escalating things. That it felt like he was doing everything out of compliance and not that his heart was really into it. And it just felt like a significant difference between him and every other person. So to me, there was no number two if he wasn't there. I don't know who I would have approached, given the AUSA saying, go find someone on the inside without him. It's just all the little things about him and some intuition. And you got to realize, Jerry, when you're listening to thousands of phone calls, you feel like you really, really get to know these people. Sometimes you're hearing them talking to a girlfriend in the background while they're on hold waiting for someone, or they're out doing mundane shopping or whatever. You get quite an insight that way.
If you knew that, if you could see that, then how come his other gang members didn't see that? You would think that that would cause them to distrust him.
Think they always knew he's not the guy you'd go to when you needed something done violent. He'd done a shooting, like everyone has to prove himself, and he admitted the shooting he didn't kill the guy, so he didn't have to get charged with murder and all these things. He did the bare minimum to get in. I realized, like, he grew up in this neighborhood. These were his friends from the time he was in first grade. They never knew him any different. His older brother was killed for the gang, so that kind of gave his family some credibility. They knew he was probably soft, but not in a way that they distrusted him. One thing he did for me is he fully turned. He was like, hey, I got an idea. I know how we can get these guys. In some ways, he was leading, and that was pretty remarkable. We hatched a plan that we convinced Eskimo and some of the others who had the most money and were doing the most drug trafficking, that he had a supply way out west that he could get kilos for 16,000 a kilo, he said. Crazy direct from Mexico price. He can't beat this. We got to do this. But the guy wants to sell 5 kilos only. Can we gather up enough money to go buy 5 kilos worth at 16,000 per kilo? They're like, yeah, we're good. We were able to get a vehicle that would become disabled at the right time. They all hit the road with all this money, go get this magical deal of cocaine on the highway, heading way out west. At some point, their car just dies. The state police roll up to help them out, and they're able to get the money, get their IDs, get the recordings that's being said within the car. When all the arrests went out later, that became an important part of the investigation as well. And then they even got with lawyers to try to, after the fact, before the arrest, explain away the money that they were going to buy an antique car or something like that, like these guys, as if they were in antique cars. So that was really good evidence. And that was something that the source just kept putting himself out there, doing what he could. I'll tell you why it's just an incredible story is we did a sweep on that case. We took down 21 more Latin kings. 5 went to trial. It was a slam dunk. We had so much evidence, and they went to trial. I don't know why, but oddly, I really, really enjoyed that trial. It was a ton of work, a lot of time, but it was almost like if you've ever studied hard for a test in school and you knew every answer and you aced it. That's how it felt. Like we knew every detail of everything. And Andy was
pretty confident.
Oh, ultra. And it almost was like, bring it on. Like, please ask me another question. Because every time the defense attorneys ask me a question, I get to give them more information that's worse. That was very hard on Andy. He had to testify. And I think that's their motivation. Quite honestly, they couldn't believe one of their own turned. A lot of these guys had such criminal histories. They knew they were going to do so much time. They thought, screw it. Let's go to trial and make him sit on the stand and make him go through that.
What about his safety? Because obviously he's risking his own life and maybe even his family by testifying.
Yes, very much. The one thing I haven't said along the way here is when you get these sources, it becomes a full-time job of babysitting them and keeping them safe. It was a rough period of my marriage, I always say, because I had a young daughter and so much time was going into work. If someone like Andy would call at 8 p.m. and we're eating dinner and he said this and that just happened, I had to say, excuse me, to my family and go take that call and spend an hour doing things to make sure he was safe. It felt like a full-time job, just keeping him safe in some ways. Once it became known he was a cooperator.
A full-time job that was definitely not a 9-to-5.
It was not. I've told this story many times. I had the time of my life. It really is as much fun as I think you could possibly have. And I could have done it 23 hours a day, but it was taking a toll on me and my family. It wasn't fair to my family. I didn't know how to get a better balance in life, so I took a job teaching at Quantico. Years later, just to have that, I got to get out of here. This will eat me up and it will ruin my marriage and all those things. In the moment, there's no saying no. You got to do what you got to do because you're in it.
It's a pull because not only do you gotta, but you want to.
That is exactly it. I've always told people, what do you do when you plan something with your family or whatever and your source calls you and goes, hey, this guy that you've been wanting to get a long time, he's willing to sell me 3 AR-15s today. You say, okay, let's get some buy money. Let's go. Let's set up an operation. We got to go get this. Not like, tell them we're good as I have plans. Now, again, you got to find balance and it's hard. Once you really, those dominoes start falling, as you said, and more people start giving you more information, that leads to more people giving you information. Pretty soon, it's almost overwhelming. Let me tell you, Jerry, like one of my favorite things I want to make sure I say is about Andy. He ended up doing everything he had to do. I remember the one time he very frustrated the prosecutor. She's saying, okay, we're going to charge Andy with this much or that. He's looking at like 16 years. And I was like, what? When I flipped him, when I recruited him, it was a promise we would take care of him the best we could. They're like, well, if we give cooperator too good of a deal, right? It looks like we bought his testimony. It hurts our case. So that was the one time I really, really felt the prosecutor wasn't right. They ended up, okay, we'll charge him less. We'll charge him with this. We got to charge him. Like, okay, I think that's understandable. He ended up doing, I think, just over 5 years. And he would keep in contact with me a little bit just because he felt some kind of loyalty to me. And he knew that getting 5 years was a great deal. And I'd gone on my way to help with that. Well, he did his time. Well, he called me years after that and say, hey, you probably have no idea what I'm up to. And to think this guy had moved way out of the area. It's hard to get a job when you're coming out of prison. He got one. He was doing manual labor. And I won't say a lot about what he's doing, but eventually he worked his way up, became a manager. He was able to get all of his kids to move with him. He was making a really good salary. He was in charge of like 100 people as a leader. He told me all of his kids were in school and on the honor roll. He was just living a good life. He was that one that turned it around and is a great citizen and keeps his kids on the straight and narrow. Met someone, married them, kind of living the American dream. It was always one of my favorite things. My whole career of all the things, it's not just about how many people you put away and for how many years. To me, that's even a better story, what happened with Andy.
That's a great story. I think many agents listening have at least one of those stories too. And it's always a highlight of our careers. I have one too that I was actually able to get the Philadelphia Inquirer to do a story about one of my informants that turned into a model citizen, even attending PTA meetings. I'm glad you had that too.
Yeah, we do what we got to do and we do it right. When it comes to law enforcement and community, I think we just want to make the community better. That's a highlight, just as I'm sure yours is. Let me just move quickly through. It's led to another kind of wiretap, another case, another sweep. But all along the way, we're collecting these cooperators who were arrested and witnesses. That really helped us to gain a lot of information. And again, strategically, we knew we need to crush the Latin Kings because they instigate. And if we could get them to do less, we think everything would quiet down. Along the way, we were putting together primarily my partner, Larissa, and by now, Paul, the old agent, had become supervisor, which was really good for us, saying, okay, maybe RICO's the way to go because federally, we can't charge murder. That's not on the books unless it's RICO. And to make sure people understand, RICO is racketeering, influence, and corrupt organizations. It was built to go after the mafia, basically, in like the 70s. What it does is if you can prove someone's part of a group and they're committing crimes and furtherance of that group, they can get lumped in with that RICO. Every one of those predicate crimes and furtherance of that group gets them in the RICO, and RICO is going to be 20 years per crime that you can charge people with. So we were looking at that. Murder is an underlying predicate crime within RICO. And so are some of the shootings and the drug trafficking that's bringing the money to the gang and all these things. So we're building a RICO, and we're going to get all the worst of the worst off the streets that we didn't wrap up with the drug trafficking. That bumped along for quite a while with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I think it was Paul as our leader who finally really pushed them on why we're being delayed. They basically came out and said, I don't think we're going to prosecute RICO. That's a lot of work. We don't have anyone in the office with experience to do it. Chicago may be famous for RICO, but that was many years ago. No one that works here currently had anything to do with that. We just want to keep charging the drug trafficking that's nice and easy and gives them big sentences. Why would we go through all of this?
Wow.
So it's quite the letdown after all the work, all the background that we did on all these guys. So I thought, okay, we got to get something out of all this work. I knew we'd collected some information on murders. Some of those were going to be the predicate acts for certain gang members. So I turned to a guy named Mike Nillis, who was a detective at the Aurora Police Department. Just an incredible guy who'd been there 20-something years, born and raised in the town, kind of a hometown hero baseball player, knew that community inside and out, had been a detective for a long time and knew every case, even if they weren't his. I turned to Mike and I asked, okay, well, we got to get some of this information to you to charge the murderers through the state. I said something about the information we had from one of our cooperators, and he knew nothing about it. He was like, what do you mean? Well, yeah, it's in the reports we gave to the task force officer. Mike's like, well, that's never made it to me. How do I not know this? And we realized that the information just wasn't working like it should have. I sat down with Mike and I said, let me call up every case file that we've done where we focused in Aurora or Latin Kings and searched the word gun, murder, homicide, shooting, whatever. And it just starts spitting out all kinds of reports. And he starts reading them and realizing, oh, this is this murder. Oh, this is that murder. Oh, this is that murder. And suddenly we're looking at a pile of documents with information on murders that, as the detective, he didn't know about. We realized we didn't really extract all the information we could out of the people we arrested because we focused on our drug conspiracy. We would get all the information about all the wiretap calls and all those things. And we'd say, while you're being interviewed, what do you know about murders in Aurora? And they'd give a little bit of information. We'd write it down and be satisfied. We realized there was something there. We took it to the state's attorney and they said, a lot of these are talking about cold case murders that we'll probably never prosecute. Like, let's take a shot, take a swing, get whatever evidence we can. We'll charge them. We'll see what happens. So that led to the creation of the cold case task force. And we grabbed a few others at the West RA there in Chicago and a few other officers. Me and Mike took the lead on that. We would find the cooperators through our federal cases, track them down. Like I remember Fang was the first one. We flew out to Los Angeles, federal incarceration there. The first time we're looking at the reports and what he said, Mike asks him, he goes, okay, you told them 2 years ago in an interview, you knew this guy did that murder. How do you know that? And Fang says, oh, I was there. And I can remember Mike looking at me like, really? You didn't follow up with that question? So he's like, well, tell us. And he told the entire story. Oh, yeah, well, I knew where a gun we saw, rival gangster disciple. We knew he was a GD, so I knew where a gun was stashed because I used to be an enforcer. We went under this trash can, got a gun, went looking for him. We eventually found him. He saw us, he ran. But then Sharky jumped out of the car, chased him down, shot him 3 times, jumped in the car. It threw the gun in the river, and we went and hid.
All right. So I take it he's not aware that even though he's saying someone else committed this murder, with him admitting his participation, he could be charged with that murder also.
Several of them asked the question, and we would say, you were looking at a lot of time, 36 years. You got it down to 18. You couldn't cooperate with us. You still are cooperating with us. And I think they kind of just realized they were in this far. They just keep cooperating. And no one ever told us no. That's a very good point. Now, at the end of the day, they did become witnesses, and some of them got charged concurrently with what they were already serving, so it didn't add more time onto them. It was handled very well from the state's point of view because they allowed us to just go around, get all these witnesses, get their statements. They created a special grand jury specifically for this investigation. And one other part of the story that's important is talk about the cooperation. Mike Nillis was such an integral part of Aurora PD and what he did. What we would do is go after witnesses who years before, when the incident happened, basically told police, call and saying, I'm not going to talk to you. But now we're reapproaching them years later, and sometimes they're in a different stage of life. And he had enough respect because he treated them so well over his 20-something years of being a cop that they would have the conversation, first of all. And then he'd normally have a story about, hey, remember when I caught you when you were a teen doing this stupid stuff and I let you go? They're always like, yeah, you always treated us right. He said, well, now I need something from you. We're diving back into this murder case. You were there. We need you to testify. None of them wanted to, but almost all of them agreed to finally say, okay, enough is enough. There's a family out there hurting. You were there. You were in the car when it happened. What really happened? And then we start finding that person's testimony matched the person that we locked up. Pretty soon we're able to make these cases. We were able to send everyone we could think of through the grand jury. And at the end of the day, we got charges for 31 people charged for 22 murders. Some of them were incarcerated. The rest, right? We had that big sweep day again, where we just went up, rounded them all up, and there was only 1 or 2 that we didn't know where they were, and we had to chase them for a while. At least from my Googling, 31 charged with 22 murders of the largest cold case murder sweep ever to have happened.
Before I hit the record button, we were talking a little bit about murders in Aurora and comparing them to murders in Chicago. Could you talk about that to give people an idea of how many were killed in this gang violence in this town?
I did research on this. I find it interesting that 1984 was the first gang murder, but from the 80s through like 2000, it went from 2 to 3 per year, maybe, to eventually when you get to the 2000s, you're looking at 20 plus per year. With Aurora's population, If you do comparative math with Chicago, it's pretty much the same rate. I know everyone points to Chicago, or always has, for the number of murders. In pure numbers, it's a huge number. But when you're talking 26 murders in Aurora with 160,000 residents, that's the rate at or higher than Chicago. You're getting 2 or 3 murders per month. There's only that few murders because they're not very good at shooting. There's a whole lot of shootings. They're just not very proficient. 2002, when I landed, come on Academy, early 2002, in that first Oracle case, 26 murders that year. And it was just common. That's just the way it was. By 2012, 10 years later, they had 0 murders for the first time since 1946. Since that cold case murder sweep in 2007, and then going into 2008, murders just kept dropping. It was quite remarkable. The city was actually growing. You had like 200,000 people now, the second largest city in the state. Shootings are down 69%. Murders are down to nothing. And it stayed very low for the rest of the time. Other than, you may remember, they were in the news in 2019. They had a shooter in a factory. He was mad at his employer. He went in and shot 6 or 7 people in an incident there. Their murders overall had been extremely low, never really getting above 10 since. It quieted down. I think it proved our theory right that the Latin Kings were the problem. They were always initiating the violence, and a lot of the other acts of violence were in retaliation. The city was able to have a resurgence. More jobs started moving in. Business would move in. Now the reputation changed and it wasn't as bad. There were more economic opportunities. And look, I don't want to dismiss what politicians were doing, what some nonprofits were doing to also tackle this problem, trying to get youth to get other outlets. It was absolutely a joint effort by lots of entities, everyone kind of pushing in the right direction, in the same direction. That city absolutely had a turnaround. And a lot of people point to that cold case sweep as one of the main reasons. It kind of put a exclamation point on all the federal cases over time, and that we're not going to stand for it any longer. This road, that's where it's going to lead you. You're no longer going to play the state system, do a few years and be back out doing the same foolishness. If we come after you, it's game over.
Well, I know that in FBI language, the goal is to disrupt and dismantle criminal enterprises. But in this particular case, you're going through it on state charges. Could you talk a little bit about the support that you got from the front office that agreed that the FBI would be involved and would support all of this work, but these murders are going to be prosecuted in the state system?
Yeah, and I have to say that once or twice when asking for things, I would hear like an ASAC or something kind of ask the question, well, what are we getting out of it? And that was rare. But I have to say, our relationship with the Aurora Police Department was so great. Again, remember, 12 agents to cover all the western suburbs, me and Larissa primarily working in Aurora. So when we needed something, we would ask the Aurora PD, hey, we need help with surveillance. They'll say, hey, we'll send you 10 guys. We'll send the gang squad and the narcotics squad out, plain clothes to help you. Constantly, they were supporting us and giving us resources. So there were times when they needed something and it was like, we're just working together. There's going to be times we're going to give up a whole lot of federal resources to support the state cases. If they needed something particularly, there's a few times they called and said, hey, you guys, FBI, a lot of resources. We got these issues or something you can do. And whether it was a tech agent or something very specific or technical or cyber-wise, we were like, that's why we're here. We're going to support you too. So the relationship was great. I thought the leadership really gave us a lot of room to do what we needed to do and trust us. As a matter of fact, just reminiscing with Paul recently prepping for this, and I'll just tell a quick story here, Jerry. We got a source who came from the police department because he was mad at the gang when he was locked up. He felt they didn't treat him right or they didn't take care of his family. He was kind of out to get him, and he got a hold of the police department upon getting out. They were like, well, if you want to be a good source, you'll work for the feds. So they brought him to me, and he did a lot of good work against his own gang. At one point, he convinced his gang that they wanted to have a gang meeting, that he could find a location. And realize, again, when you're looking at the RICO and some of these things, we have to prove you're in the gang. Like getting you on video at a gang meeting is incredible evidence for us. We were able to acquire a house that he convinced the gang members that it was a vacant house that he had access to, that we wired up. He had the gang have their meeting at this house. Meanwhile, our leadership approved we needed to be there to protect him in case something went wrong, in case one of the devices was found. But the neighborhood wasn't real good for us to have people in place. So we actually went into the attic with long guns, with vests, with our monitoring information so we could hear what was going on below. We're one floor above about 80 Latin King gang members having a meeting. And then eventually they went down to the basement. Paul was joking as the supervisor said, "How did you get leadership to allow you to do that?" And like he said, first of all, they trusted us. We'd been doing such good work for so long that there was trust. But he said, I told him that we would find a ballistic blanket put down beneath us in case they started shooting through the ceiling.
Ballistic blanket?
Yeah, I don't know what that means. Does that exist? But whatever. He said, this is probably what ops plans work like they are now. You could just kind of have a verbal with the ASAP or the SAC. Because the SAC asked questions, I answered them, and he said, okay, be careful. I remember we're up there in that attic. Try not to move around too much, not make any noise. We're able to listen only to places where our source is. Listeners may not know this. Without a judge's signature, you can't listen to a conversation unless there's a consenting party. Well, our consenting party is our source, but he's moving from room to room to room. And if he's not in a room, we can't listen. We have to stop listening to that room and move to the room where he moved. But fortunately, we hear him having a conversation with somebody, and one of the young gang members comes up and tells us, there's feds out there. Of course, our ears perk up there. He says, yeah, I was driving here like 2 blocks down in a brown car. There's 2 white dudes sitting in there. I know they're feds. I know exactly who it is. It's Tom from our unit who's, on perimeter out there. So they decide to give that young kid a gun, and he says, I'm not afraid of feds. I'll go kill both of them right now. And he leaves the house. So we're scrambling to get comms with Tom without being too loud, being up in the attic. But eventually we're able to get a hold of him and say, hey, you've been made, get the hell out of there. Just go far, far away. Be nowhere near there. We're just reminiscing like that they let us do that. It was incredible evidence. It became important in a lot of ways. I'm not sure if today they would let something like that fly.
I wonder, yeah. When we're talking about these murders, were they mostly gang-related murders? Who's being killed? Not that it makes a difference that it was another gang member. Life and thou shalt not kill still needs to be respected. But I would like to get understanding of who was being murdered and what their families were thinking, because no matter who you are, you've got a family behind you. And initially, when these murders were not being solved, was that another motivation for you to move forward with this?
Great question, Jerry. And it's kind of yes to all of it. What's interesting is if we're talking the Hispanic population in Aurora back when I'm out there working in the early 2000s, the first generation Hispanics came in. I'm sure there was hard times. They came in without a lot of education, not knowing the language, trying to make it. They were good, hardworking people. It was their children who were the ones who became the gang members. A lot of these guys, you would see, like their parents were not happy at all with this. They didn't understand how the streets had taken away their kids. They're working multiple jobs and their kids are left to the streets. Just to put that in place, all the young kids in certain parts of the town were from one of the gangs. The shootings were typically gang to gang. They weren't out being serial killers, murdering people for no reason. There was purpose behind all their murders. However, they didn't always get it right. If they saw somebody who was Hispanic that they didn't know, like, well, you're not a Latin King, you must be an insane deuce. If they saw somebody black, if you're a Latin King, you're like, well, you're either a vice lord or a gangster disciple, so you're a rival gang member. There was a Marine home on leave who was just seen, assumed to be a gang member when he wasn't, and was shot and killed. That's one of the cases we closed. It was actually that third sweep. Roman Lucio was the one who did that, and he had to admit that to us as he became a cooperator, how he felt bad that he didn't realize that it was a Marine. Another military connection, actually, there was a 17-year-old kid whose mother was deployed to Germany. He was living with his grandmother, and he'd bounced around in military installations. And his mother always had a regret that she felt her son kind of wasn't ready to understand the streets because he grew up on military installations. And at 17, when she gets deployed, he goes to live with grandma in Aurora. He ends up being killed, assumed to be a gang member when he's not at all. Just because he was standing in front of a house at one point and someone drove by and saw him. And it was a young gang member who needed to do his murder to prove the gang his worth or whatever, and saw it as an opportunity and took it. Some of the stories after the sweep went down, the relief of the family is pretty powerful. Some of these kids were mixed up in the gangs, but still there was a hurting family out there. This kid was 16, 17. Yes, he was out there at the gang doing stupid stuff, but he would have grown out of it. He was a good kid. He was funny. All those things. There's really humanity in all of them, in particular families. Every one of these is just a horrible tragedy. Preventable had they not done that. One more I'll say, just to underscore how bad it can be with these gangs. There was one we charged 4 with where a guy was hanging around with the gang, and because some odd situations, we always had sources that helped us take the gangs down. We do our job right. They never know who our sources are. So they start speculating. They speculated this young kid who was kind of new around the gang. I think he was only like 16. They're like, are you really a Latin king? You're not that snitch, are you? And whatever. And they didn't like his answers. So they just started beating him. They beat him not quite to death until they gave a baseball bat to a guy nicknamed Midnight, who took the bat to his head and finished the guy off. Took his shirt and his shoes and ran off and left his body there. There was always a motivation about the gang behind the violence, but they got it wrong so much. So many lives destroyed, families ruined over stupid things. So being able to be a part of helping to really lessen that is pretty incredible, because that was a PD, a sheriff's office, the FBI, the ATF, the DEA, U.S. Attorney's Office, county prosecutor, like everybody all working together. Quite a turnaround to go from those kind of senseless murderers to the gang members are still out there. There's still problems here and there, but they don't feel that they own the city. They can do what they want. They kind of know there's repercussions for what they do now. One thing I just want to highlight real quick here, Jerry, there's one more murder is very noteworthy. Obviously, there are 31 charged with 22 murders. Plus, along the way, cooperators are giving us information. We're able to charge a few more, so that number is actually larger. But when this is all said and done, the Aurora Police Department comes up and says, hey, there's one more murder that's plagued this city. It's not solved. Is there anything you can do? And it's a 6-year-old kid who was killed while sleeping back in the 90s. I said, well, let me look into it. It's kind of a noteworthy case, but I didn't know a lot of details, and it never really came up in what we were doing. Come to find out that the person who allegedly did it knew that cops were onto him and had moved to Mexico and been down there for many, many years and was never coming back. So there's no way to get him out of Mexico. And we really didn't have enough evidence to charge him anyway to even get an arrest warrant. It was just people knew, but there was no one willing to testify. No occurrence witnesses particularly. Like all agents do, you hit up all your sources and you say, does anyone know anything? And I had a source who was able to say, I think I can get in contact with them. And actually was able to call them based on everything that had been newsworthy about all the arrests. And get in touch and say, what's going on? Yeah, your name didn't come up. You should be good. But the guy reiterated, I'm never leaving Mexico. I'm certain they're going to arrest me the minute I step foot in the United States, but I'm not going to pull the trigger. I shouldn't have to be stuck down here. When it's the same prosecutor who had done the cold case murder sweep, we'd asked what he thought about that. And he said, look, we would like to get this case solved for this family particularly. We could find a way to get him to testify that he wasn't the trigger puller, but he was there. We could work with him. I can't find my source, so I got to find a way. So I was able to get a defense attorney agree to represent this guy in Mexico and use my source to kind of hand him off to say, hey, I was talking to this defense attorney, whatever story he's got to tell. So now we got a defense attorney in communication with the guy in Mexico and the state's attorney and us. So we're able to communicate. We're able to strike a deal that if he will come back and testify, he'll get charged with some low level and not the murder itself. The prosecutor says, but he's got to pass a lie detector test. So I set up one of our polygraphers to go down to Mexico to give him a lie detector test. And the defense attorney happens to own like some vacation home in like one of the resort towns where everyone could meet, because the guy did not trust us down in Mexico. But with this defense attorney, he was willing to go to his place. Well, then we find out it's illegal to do a polygraph in Mexico, that if we tried, they would seize the equipment and arrest the agent. We feel we're stuck, but then the police department lets us know one of their guys is certified as a voice stress analyzer. And I'm not even sure what that is.
Me either.
Yeah, it's going to tell you, according to your voice, if you're lying or telling the truth. The prosecutor says, hey, we'll also accept that if he can pass that. That's just like a laptop you take with you. That one in cause an international incident. As the FBI, I kind of just back out and let the police department get their guy, send him down to Mexico. The guy passes. So we bring him back up. He becomes a source.
I was thinking it was somebody in Mexico was a voice stress. No. It was somebody with the Aurora Police Department.
Yes. Now, whether that's legal in Mexico or not, I don't know. I didn't ask. I felt that was their job to figure out the legalities, or they did what they got to do. It was just a laptop, not fancy equipment, so probably it was pretty easy. So he came back, and then he became my source, full-time job. He's got to do a lot of work and give me a lot of information so they can get paid so he can live and afford to live, because when you're a source for the FBI, you can't commit crimes. So you can't go out there doing illegal things to make money. So his only source of making money was to do everything he could to provide me information so that I could pay him for a short period. He was able to cooperate with several murderers, particularly the Nico Contreras murder. He testified and he said, here's what happened. He was a Latin king. He flipped and became an insane deuce, which is rare. First time I'd ever heard of it. And there's a family connection. Somehow it happened. But the insane deuces thought, well, we got to know you're really loyal to us now. So you need to prove it. You need to kill a Latin king. As a matter of fact, they picked a guy who he was basically friends with when he was a Latin king. You got to go kill that guy. Talking through it, he said, well, I do know where that guy sleeps. This place in the basement, there's a window right there. The leader of the gang sends him and another insane deuce member out to do the job. They go to the back of the house, and he testifies that when they get there, he's just like, man, I can't do it. And the guy's trying to like, man, you got to do it. You got to prove yourself. They're going to kill you if you don't do this. And he's like, I don't know. And the other guy says, I'll do it. And grabs the gun out of his hand, shoots multiple times through the window. They can't really see into the basement. They just shoot through the basement window. And then they run, jump in the car and leave. And later realize the intended target was not home that night. And his 6-year-old nephew, Nico, had gone to sleep in his uncle's bed and was shot twice in the back and killed.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah. And it really was. That needed to be solved because that was such a stain. Like, what kind of city are we that a 6-year-old gets murdered and years and years and years go by and nothing happens? Very fortunate that all worked out, that the person came from Mexico, had to testify, found some other evidence. The driver of that incident got charged with 60 years and the shooter 70 years. And doing a little research with this, I had no idea that this happened, but I saw an article from 2018. Nico's 3-year-old brother at the time of the murder in 2018 became an Aurora police officer. And I just think that's really cool. They never kind of gave up on the city and they're on the right side of things. There are some good stories out of all this, that the town's trying to rebound, people trying to do the right thing, and that maybe good can win here.
That's beautiful. Hearing the story really gives us an understanding of what policing can mean to the community, because I'm sure when that case was solved, that many members of the community who were uncomfortable or who questioned the presence of police realized the benefits of what policing is about, and that it's all about keeping the community safe.
Actually, that family held a celebration in 2010 in a park to recognize everybody who helped. I had moved on to Quantico by that time. I saw newspaper articles. It was thanking the police and the FBI and the whole system and the community. That's at the far end of the range of the good that can be done. It's back to that from Hoover. The most effective weapon against crime is cooperation. And a big part of that is the community. Particularly Mike Nillis was able to get community members to finally say, okay, we're going to come on board with the police and the FBI, and we're going to testify. That's what it's all about. You're right, Jerry. There's a lot of crime happening right now. I'm not saying this is the perfect game plan for how to do things, but I do know it's got to be police working with the community. You got to bring them on your side. You got to let them know we're there for the right reasons and we're there to help, because it's the only way to get through this.
It must be so validating to understand that that family, the little 6-year-old's family, felt so good about the resolution of that case that his brother became a police officer. Yes. That's the ultimate validation of the work that you did.
I just found that out recently when I was doing a search, and I'm still living off a high from reading that a few days ago.
I really appreciate you doing a case review of this cold case and drug investigation against the Latin Kings that resulted in making the city of Aurora safer today.
Aurora is not well known except for the movie Wayne's World was allegedly supposed to be Aurora, and it's because the writer was from that area. And I used to say, when I talk about Aurora, it's like, if you've seen Wayne's World, it's nothing like that. Well, as time goes on, it's getting closer to that version in the movie where it's just a good city to live and work with schools. Hopefully it's on the right track.
This case had an enormous impact on the city of Aurora. Plus, it was an unbelievable investigation with remarkable results. What type of rewards did you and the team receive for this case?
Along the way, there were several between the county, the PD. A big one was the Chicago Crime Commission for the whole area of Chicago had a big event. That one really sticks out because it was a lot of competition, obviously, in the entire region and kind of a black tie affair. You got to bring in your spouse and you got the Star of Distinction Award and all these things. So absolutely felt that it was recognized over and over and over. And the joke is my wife's a teacher. She says, I've been teaching special ed for 20 years. No one's ever thanked me. Every time you turn around, you seem to be getting another award. But really, everybody was so appreciative that the county would go out of their way to host a dinner and give an award and that. So several things came from it, and Chicago Crime Commission was the big one. I don't remember if I mentioned this to you, Jerry, but in 2008, Officer Mike Nillis I worked with was IACP's Police Officer of the Year for the nation after the cold case murder, and well-deserved, like I said. That could not have been done without him. He was uniquely qualified and had lived 20-something years as an incredible cop. That reputation allowed him to break through to people and get people to agree to be witnesses in really hard times. Well-deserved.
We're at the part of this case review, this episode, where I asked my standard question of when and why you joined the FBI.
I joined in 2002. I'll tell the quick version of this story, Jerry. I lowered the educational requirements for the FBI. I was in the Air Force. I was a Spanish linguist. I knew I wanted to do something that mattered, but I was an enlisted person in the Air Force for 10 years during the 90s. One of the guys was leaving to go join the FBI, Willie Rios. I was like, wait, how's he going to the FBI? And as the first time I kind of understood, okay, the background of what I'm doing with intelligence and all this stuff is something the FBI is looking for. I plugged away at getting a degree. I was doing online correspondence courses. I was always traveling with the Air Force, so I couldn't go to traditional classes. So I found a way to get a degree through Thomas Edison State College that put credits together. I was open. I was in Omaha at the time. I asked the Omaha office. They said, no, you're good. Eventually moved down to Panhandle, Florida and applied from there as I was getting out of the military. They came back and said, you don't have a resident degree. That's not good enough. So after being accepted and waiting like a year or two where there was no academy classes happening at the time and they were doing background, I got the note, your degree's not good enough. I appealed through my congressman, who is now a news personality, Joe Scarborough. I got a rejection letter saying, nope, your degree is not good enough. Well, 5 months later, I get a call from the applicant coordinator in Jacksonville. They say, hey, we've changed our educational requirements. Your degree is not good enough. You want back in? I'm like, yes, I do. It really didn't affect my timing of coming into the Bureau because there just was not much hiring happening in 2000, 2001. But then after 9/11, I remember thinking, okay, I bet we start hiring. And it was like a call within a week. Hey, get ready. We're ramping up classes. We're going to be doing them every 2 weeks. So I got in right after 9/11. Kind of a funny story, Jerry, when I'm moving from Chicago to the DC area because I needed to get out of that life. I'm going through my files and I find that rejection letter. Sorry, your degree's not good enough. And it's signed by Unit Chief Mike Mason. The very next piece of paper that's just in my personal file is AD Mike Mason. Congratulations on having one of the top 10 gang cases of the year.
I know Mike Mason. Did you ever tell him that story?
I told him the story. I don't know that he really got it because I was trying to joke, like, right? You tried to keep me out saying I wasn't good enough. Then when I finally got in, you told me, hey, it was one of the best cases of the year. Yeah, I just thought that was funny. They told me, you're lucky, Cory. When they called me, it's like, how am I lucky? Like, this upset my life. I didn't know what I was going to do with the rest of my life. They're like, well, as of today, you should be able to apply to be an agent. You're already through phase one, phase two background. Like, so you're going to be the first person we ever let in with the non-resident degree in our eyes. So that's my joke. That I single-handedly lowered the academic expectations to be an agent.
Wow. And I guess nowadays, so many people get a degree online, but I guess at the time it was something that was new and that they weren't sure about.
Yeah. And I remember doing a little research, trying to say, like, why is my degree good enough? Like, I took all the real classes and like all these things. And I was doing research at the time of all the universities that had online courses. I didn't get a good answer, but it was just like, well, the way you did it wasn't good enough. But yeah, nowadays it wouldn't be even a consideration.
The work that you did on this particular case shows everyone that you had what the FBI needed.
Thank you. It was truly one of the joys of my life. Like I said, I could have done it 24 hours a day. You just knew you were making a difference. So it's easy to be kind of all in.
Absolutely. I want to talk about what you did later in your career before we talk about what you're doing now.
My initial thing, I moved out of Chicago. Like I said, I didn't know how to find balance. So I got a job teaching new agents at Quantico. And that's fantastic. And I was doing the source recruitment because I had a lot of experience doing that. I always knew I loved teaching. That's something that's just a passion of mine. So I did that for a while. I dreamed of the Office of Congressional Affairs, and I took that job and realized the commute to DC was a burden for having a family and trying to coach my daughter's softball team and all those other things. It was really difficult. So I ended up stepping down after several months and just went back to casework. To me, that's where the real work is. So I was able to trip along the initial anonymous case, even though I wasn't a cyber guy, and try to help. So that was fascinating. Did some intellectual property rights crimes. I was able to use my knowledge of a lot of the subpoenas and affidavits to take down a lot of illegal sites selling NFL jerseys, and some intel work before my dream job of opening up of teaching at the FBI National Academy. I'm a leadership nerd. I always wanted to be part of teaching leadership. I got that job. I was able to do that for several years, got promoted to be in charge of all the instructors at the National Academy. And then my last several years, they moved me over to run the program. So I ran the FBI NA until I retired in January of 2002.
All right. If you could just take a moment to explain what the National Academy is for those who have no idea that the FBI even has such a program.
Yeah, it is truly, we say it's like one of the greatest educational programs in the nation, yet nobody really knows about it. Every year, we bring in 267 law enforcement executives from around the world 4 times a year. Right now, we're bringing in about 30 internationals. The rest are domestic, lieutenants, captains, deputy chiefs. They're going to live with us for 10 weeks at the FBI Academy in Quantico. And it's in residence. They are taking 6 classes that are certified through University of Virginia. As an instructor, you are teaching classes for UVA. And so they're all earning 17 credits. They have to take a leadership course. They have to take a physical fitness course. But it's just this unique thing where we build this network of people that we bring in, and we do everything we can to give them a great experience, to give them the best speakers, the best education, and make it like a finishing school for law enforcement executives. Many chief jobs say almost like requirement FBI NA grad. We let the field pick who comes in. For every opening we have 1,000 who want in or more. It's very competitive. We prepare them to be the best leaders they can and make law enforcement the best we can. Incredible program.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it is the highlight of what we talked about before, and that is law enforcement partnerships. It's a foundation where a lot of that is built on.
There's been 55,000 graduates, and the network is strong. When you're a National Academy graduate, you go to the database, you call someone else, and you say, hey, I'm an NA grad. I think we're up to our 285th session now. And you say, hey, I'm a grad from whatever year. The person says, what do you need? You just work together. You solve cases. You get things done. The networking is incredible. I don't know where we'd be without it.
You retired in 2022 from that great job you had running the National Academy. What are you doing now?
Yeah, I tell you, the reason I left is because I had an opportunity. This nonprofit called Dedication to Community. It's all about bringing community and policing together. My role coming in as the Senior Vice President for Law Enforcement Relations is to use the credibility of my career in the National Academy and all that to say this is really good training. This is something that will improve the ability of your officers to build better relationships, but it also helps the community understand cops. That position was offered and I retired because of that, but I always take on more than I can chew. Before I retired, one of the agents that I worked with named Pete Cordero left to get on a really good corporate job. And I remember him telling me that he had gotten hired and been assigned a coach. And he talked to me about the role of a coach. And I guess I was ignorant of how many professions have coaches for how to help people get better and make the best out of everyone.
As far as being a leader or a manager?
Just in general, like being the best version of yourself. There's some executive coaches, life coaches kind of can have a bad name, But in general, it's I'm going to focus on you and help you see things about yourself you don't see and just help make you better. So I got really intrigued when Pete said, Cory, in the private sector, everybody who has significant responsibility in decision-making as a coach, that's just how it works. And I remember thinking, who has significant responsibility in decision-making? Chiefs of police. Yet they don't get that support. I actually went through like a 1.5 year long program to get certified as an International Coaching Federation certified coach, saying I want to coach some chiefs, try to help make people better. Along the way came, at this time it was Axon. Now it's been rebranded to Performance Protocol, but they created a company specifically to bring coaching to law enforcement. I realized rather than coaching a few chiefs, if I took a role with this company, I could really make a huge impact. I'm the coach training director, one of two. I built the training where we bring in good people who understand law enforcement and who want to learn to be coaches, and we give them some training. And then they're out there, basically like a dating app. Clients will come on the website. They'll search through profiles. They'll find like a good match, and then they'll just start a coaching client relationship. That's still being built, but I think it's going to change the profession quite a bit. I think we're about to hit a tipping point and really make a big difference in law enforcement.
What's the name of both of those?
The first one is dedication to community. And I'd point anyone who's interested in the work we're doing in South Florida. The Miami Heat are a big part of that. In the Miami Police Department, we're doing great work. We call it D2C, but it's dedication to community. The other one is Performance Protocol. That is the law enforcement coaching. We're trying to help with the issues and recruiting and retaining and just help make people better.
All right. For those who are very curious to learn more about the work you're doing now, I'll have links in the show notes for both of those companies. Well, it sounds like you've had a lot of experience in leadership and coaching. I absolutely can't wait to hear your words of wisdom, because I like to give my guest the last word. What would you like to say?
I think in all of this, the key is self-awareness. And that's a simple word. And you might say, yeah, whatever, but really understand how far that is. It's almost something I don't think you can get yourself. You almost need another person who you trust, but isn't there just to prop up your ego, letting you know about yourself. It's no different than when I was working the streets, trying to learn how to build rapport and have empathy for people who were nothing like me, who I didn't exactly relate with, but understanding enough about myself and how I'm seen to build relationships with people and connect and get sources and have people trust me and make my cases. That carries over right to your leadership, knowing that you're not going to be perfect. You're going to have faults, but just to be aware. And I'd tell you, I've learned so much about myself. Anyone who tells me I've done a good job as a leader, I'm going to point to that's what it takes. I had a young man hit me up over the years who's been trying to become an agent. He's like, hey, I got my class date. What do I got to do to prepare? I'm not lying about this, Jerry. One thing I said is to start listening to your podcast and start checking out your website and those things. The other thing I said, don't overdo it and go think you're going to learn about every federal investigation or every profiler book. Understand the profession, but really get to know yourself and your ability to lead people and be vulnerable. And know there's some things you're good at, and some things you're not. You're going to work as a team as an agent. You need to learn like, hey, I'm good at this, but about that, let me find someone else who can help me. So I think it all comes back to being self-aware enough to know how do we work as a group, which I think is my whole theme of everything I talked about. We got to do everything as a team.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a direct link to the show notes where you'll find a photo of Cory McGookin, along with links to articles about this case and information about the Latin Kings in general. There's also a link to other FBI retired case file reviews, episodes about gangs and drugs, and a link to learn more about the FBI National Academy. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.